So this is kind of a quick and dirty solution. I was running into an issue with the way that I was storing these configurations, where this subproperty, when I had this optional as it was before, get router path, and then calling that on one of the routes, was saying that sub could be optional. And I wasn't really sure how to navigate that, so I just got rid of the optionality of that element in the route configuration. Then I had to go through all of the actual routes that I'm using and then add that property. The reason that I'm using sub is because I want to be able to have nested routes. And the reason that I chose specifically sub as the string is because I'm not using it anywhere else in the code base. So I know that if I were to do a case sensitive search, actually turn on regex and then do /b. And for the most part, I'd be able to find the examples of where I'm using specifically that property. If this were a large code base, I wouldn't be able to do that kind of string search because there very well could be a reason why I would want to use sub as a property name. So in the future, I might want to change that. Thankfully, with TypeScript, I should be able to change that in a relatively discrete location. Like if I were to refactor this now, then I could say subroute configuration. Or subconfig map. And that should change everywhere else. This isn't necessarily a safe bet because I don't know. Yeah, I guess it is. But I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to want to use specifically this pattern. Mostly because I don't want to need to define a property on something that already exists. And I'm kind of curious if moving as iRoute config map will change it so that when I click on specifically that property, let me see. Yeah, it still goes to key string. Do I even need that type definition there anyways? Because maybe I don't. Yeah, maybe I don't. So for the time being, I was just trying to get the error to go away because I fundamentally just wanted to make it possible to deploy them the day that I was deploying them. And there's an issue here. I'm not sure why that was broken for a sec. So now is the time in code review, because that was just trying to get something out. Excuse me. In code review, I would want to really scrutinize whether it was worth changing all of these routes to have a subconfig map. It isn't very offensive, and it isn't really going to add a significant performance degradation, but looking for this property across the code base might make it a bit more difficult to actually find. So I'm going to change this to be optional. I have subconfig map as a parameter that's optional. I'm going to remove this from all of the routes. And see if that causes any issues. So I'm just going to run the TypeScript compiler. And I think that should be fine. Yeah, we're running into it again. Users, admin users route, subconfig. So that's because I have iRoute config as a property on all of these. So there's the trade-off. When I add iRoute config to this admin users route, I'm specifying that I want to make sure that as I'm modifying this object, I know that these properties are related to something. Theoretically, I could just go on the faith that subconfig map is probably going to be the name of that property wherever I want it to be, but I don't necessarily know that long term. Like when I was returning to this code base in the first place, I ran into that error and wasn't really expecting it. So adding subconfig map as a property makes it a bit easier for me to trust that that is going to be, that specific value. Making sure that it's on every single route config. If I were better at TypeScript, then there's probably some sort of TypeScript foo that I could use to get over that. But, I don't really want to need to be an expert in TypeScript for this to be. Right? I don't want the person who interprets this code base to need to be an expert in TypeScript to competently make changes to the code base. Like theoretically, in some spaces, that would be a good idea, but just for the sake of what I'm going for, I'm not trying to have that be the case. So let me run that TypeScript compiler again. Cool. So it compiles, and I don't love that that's the case, but in the short term, this is fine. At some point, I might go back through and see that this property isn't really something that I want on all of the routes. I might say there's a better way to do this, but for the time being, I'm just going to commit this. So I'm going to do git status to see what I've changed, because I feel like I made a couple of other ones as well. So I added OGG images and logos for each of the sites. Logo, OGG image, Okay, so one of the assumptions that I'm making is that as I'm going through this code base, I'm probably going to use some sort of assistive AI to help me go through all of these commits and make sure that I'm doing the things that I'm trying to. So I'm going to make a comment too to should subconfig map be a property on every iRoute config. And here I'm using the string directly iRoute config because I want to make sure that I know that's the type that I'm referring to. I don't want it to be ambiguous that I'm referring to a type. In this case, you're going to see a few different debates across a few different spaces about whether using this I prefix. It's kind of like Hungarian notation, and some would argue that Hungarian notation is outdated. But for the sake of working on a code base and not necessarily knowing what's going on, I find it pretty helpful. The last time that I committed to this code base, like seriously, well, I think that it was a couple days ago. But before that, I think that it had been a couple of weeks. So for the sake of just making it easy for me to see that iRoute config here is the same as iRoute config in the code base, and knowing that that's referring to one specific type, I find it easier. Should subconfig map be a property on every iRoute config? Before, it was optional. Now, it recently made required of for the sole purpose of reducing possibly undefined errors on compilation. Added OGG image and logo for each site. Compiled, I guess built. That's good for now.